Good evening, I'm Laurie Johnson. Welcome to Houston Public Media's web series, Political Perspectives. Every week I'll be joined by show commentators Aiyer and Brandon Rottinghaus to discuss all things political. Tonight we'll continue the conversation from Red, White, and Blue about the 2016 Houston Area Survey by Stephen Klineberg and the Kinder Institute at Rice University. So let's get started, Jay and Brandon. First of all, the interesting thing about this survey, a lot of times when we hear poll results and survey results, we're talking about registered voters or even likely voters. In this survey, we're not burrowing down to voters. This is just people who live in the Houston region. How does that make it different from, say, a voter survey?
Yeah, I mean, one way to read this is just that, it's the difference between it being kind of an open-ended idea where people can chime in on their responses, like talking with someone in their living room, versus a snapshot in time of like their political views. So the snapshot view, where you have a smaller number of randomly selected people, is much more tailored to the political moment. You've got those things affected by media, by the personalities involved. The bigger the picture, like the Kinder survey, the more likely you've got a kind of wider perspective on things. So the differences are somewhat mathematical. I mean, you've got differences in terms of how you can predict and whether or not you can use that as a way to have a true confidence, right? So the more you are asking, the less likely you are to know for certain that that's what's happening. So the confidence interval is a little bigger, but generally they're going to give you the margin of error on that, so you can get a sense of kind of where precisely it is. But politically speaking, it's going to give you a different version of what you're going to see. So they talked a little bit about the differences politically, and those are clear differences. And I think that the trend is probably in that direction, but reading this as the Democrats are going to win is wrong, because you don't necessarily have that, right? We're talking about the difference between voters and likely voters even, right? And so there's lots of dynamics there that don't lend itself to a kind of natural, people's opinion to election kind of outcome.
So what is this, what can it be used for as far as a tool to predict things?
Well, I mean, what it does, it gives you sort of large, broad trends. Right? I mean, Dr. Klineberg has been doing this survey for the better part of, I think, 15, 20 years. And so what it does is it gives you a large, longitudinal view of how the city and really this community has moved and progressed over time. And you can look at specific issues. You can see the changes in the attitudes towards things like gay rights, things like the immigration, race relations. And so there's a lot of useful things it can offer in terms of giving you that kind of macro view of how we as sort of the greater Houston community have evolved over time. That's really what its strength at. And I mean, to Brandon's point, if you read it as, hey, it shows that the political direction of the city, it's probably not its highest and best use. If you're looking at it to say, what are the sort of the broader attitudes and changes of the way the city has moved, I think there's a lot of utility out of it.
So one of the things that came out of it was this shift in political parties. And the interesting thing is, I think it's more of an incremental shift toward the Democratic Party, but sort of a large shift away from the Republican Party. Fewer people are declaring themselves Republicans and kind of more moving to independent. And then incrementally more people are declaring themselves Democrats. So what does that tell us about how maybe demographics are changing in the region? Yeah,
it used to be that Austin was like the blueberry and the tomato soup, right, of red Texas, and now it looks more like a pepperoni pizza. You've got Dallas, which is more Democratic, and of course Austin, El Paso, San Antonio. And if Houston is in that direction, then it's going to definitely be the case that you're going to have a much more competitive two-party state. So the ramifications are pretty big, but it's hard to read this as a direct translation in terms of the victories for Democrats. So don't pop the champagne cork yet, right? Because you've got lots of things at play. You've got districts which are drawn to enhance one party or the other, regardless of the perspective of the people who live there. You've got people who are motivated to vote in different sequences. Like some people are going to come out no matter what. Like every week you look for an election, and some people never come even though they're registered to vote. So you've got turnout problems. You've got an imbalance, I think, between party power, right? The Republicans have been well organized. The Democrats have been less well organized. So you've got all these different political dynamics that don't necessarily lend itself to that. The demographics are part of that too. You've got an emerging Latino electorate, but it's still just that. The sort of book on this is that it's the sleeping giant, but they're still at slumber. And so until you see these major changes, until you see this development being prompted by either outside groups or by parties, you're not going to see major change.
And one of the things Dr. Klineberg has suggested is as this Latino population grows, that perhaps the Republican Party needs to back off some of the rhetoric around immigration and around diversity, because we actually see on the survey that regardless of political affiliation, regardless of which race category you fall into, that people are increasingly in favor of, welcoming different people groups into Houston, having more diverse neighborhoods, that kind of thing. So if the Republicans want to kind of maintain that presence, they need to maybe shift their talk about it.
Right. I mean, what the survey essentially shows is this: you're seeing an aging of the predominantly Republican voting blocs, the Anglo population. Essentially, they're losing their voters because they're aging out. And you've got a new cadre of voters that are younger and sort of coming into play. But again, they have to be registered and they have to turn out. But these voters are for a whole variety of reasons trending Democratic. And so I think to Klineberg's point is less about sort of the rhetorical element, but the simple fact is that that your voters right now, if you're a Republican Party person, are they essentially dying away? And that your only chance for survival politically over time, and again, it's important, we're not talking one election cycle or 2 election cycles, we're talking over a period of time, is that you have to get your new voters, because all of your new voters in Harris County and Fort Bend County over a 10, 15-year period are going to be minority. And so if you're not aggressively seeking that out, then you as a party are not going to be able to exist. And so that's really, I think, the larger message. I think the question as to sort of the rhetoric around immigration and other issues is really the here and now. So you've got sort of 2 competing things. Politics is really about this moment in time, trying to get out your base and trying to keep the other guy from getting his person out. But over time, over a 5, 8, 10-year period, it's a bigger issue, and you've got to reach out, and that's really what I think what it says.
So the other thing that really struck me is Dr. Klineberg talks a lot about diversity and how especially Fort Bend County, but also Harris County, are among the most racially diverse counties in the country. Fort Bend maybe perhaps in the world. And yet we know at the same time that in Houston and in the region, we may be extremely diverse, but we're still very segregated. How does that affect kind of, the issues we're talking about? This is, sure, yes, we're, 30% Anglo and 25% Latino and so forth, but we don't all live together.
Yeah. I think diversity is a strength, and politicians often talk about it that way, but it's also a real challenge because you've got serious undercutting of the ability for people to get ahead when you've got serious problems of differences in terms of the income people earn. You've got in Houston one of the few cities where you've got the top and bottom are growing in the same direction. So you've got the top who are growing more rich and the bottom who are growing more poor. This is not a great recipe for there to be the kind of motion that's needed to be able to advance a great city like Houston. You also have serious problems of people trying to just simply make ends meet. You've got problems of affordable housing, right? After the flooding, this has become a big issue. You've got transportation deserts, you've got food deserts. So the kind of problems that the city faces with respect to race and income are going to be huge. So this gives us a window in terms of how to make a plan to solve these kinds of things. So obviously there are lots of different organizations, and the city itself is working on these kinds of partnerships to try to figure out a way to make this better. And so to know what's happening is important so that these sorts of things can be addressed, because if you don't know what's going on, then you can't figure out what the solution should be.
Yeah. And of course we're all kind of saying, well, I'm in favor of diversity, but I still live in my primarily Anglo or primarily black neighborhood, but I'm all for diversity.
Right. I mean, Houston, this region, is the most economically segregated part of the country. We're the most economically segregated largest city. So sort of embedded in all of this happy news of the diversity is the simple fact that income inequality is a huge issue in Houston, Texas, and will be. And the only way you're going to deal with that is sort of overt policy changes. And so one of I think the more interesting questions that comes out of the surveys is, what are the policy changes that need to be put in place to alleviate some of the problems that it sort of identifies, right? We know we're economically segregated. We know we're the most. We know that, to Brandon's point, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are actually getting poorer. And so how do we deal with that? And some of that is in education, but that's segregated as well. So we've got a lot of complexity, and so the survey is a good sort of snapshot, but we should need to be careful, because I know there's a tendency to want to look at it in really positive ways and say, look, you know, we're great, we're the most diverse city in the world, or in the country, but there's a whole set of challenges that need to be dealt with, and that's really what I think the takeaway ought to be.
One promise that you found there was that people say that they want to spend more money on income inequality, and they want to have government have more of a role in that. That's really interesting, right? For a county that's basically mixed Republican Democrat, right? The fact that people are more inclined to see this problem and say, let's fix it, is, I think, a really interesting important sign here.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for helping us understand the Houston area survey. Thank you for watching the program. Remember to log on to houstonpublicmedia.org/perspectives every Friday night at 8 p.m. following the 7:30 broadcast of Red, White, and Blue. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next week.